everyone, it's Vicky, and recently I played in the US Open Chess Championship, one of the largest chess tournaments in the world. Today, I'm excited to share with you my experience through a travel vlog and a recap of my most thrilling game. I was also invited to be a delegate representing Texas. Delegates from each state meet during the US Open to discuss and vote on policies that shape the future of chess, so it was an honor having a voice in that process. You'll see more about that later, but for now, let's get started with the video. We're on a plane right now from Austin to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and then we have a 90-minute drive to Madison where the US Open will be held. Welcome to Milwaukee! We've arrived! I made it to my hotel. It's currently 7 p.m. and my first round starts tomorrow at 3 p.m. since I'm playing on the 5-day schedule, so I still have a little more time to relax and prepare my openings. I'm having dinner, and for my appetizer I have French onion soup. Good morning. Today it is Wednesday, July 30th, and I'm having breakfast right now. And then later we're going to go look at the venue because it's at a different hotel. I'm headed to round 1 of my tournament. Today it is Friday, August 1st, 11 a.m. and I am headed to my round 6 out of 9 of the US Open. I'm currently on 2.5 out of 5 points, so let's see how the next round goes. Alright, so now I'm going to be recapping my round 6 game because I think that it was definitely the most fun from an audience perspective because there were some mistakes and sacrifices involved, and I was playing with the black pieces. So my opponent started with 1d4, and now I had a few minutes beforehand to prepare, so I knew that he was going to play the London system, and I usually have a setup against this. I like to play knight f6, d5, and then c5 over here just to put a little pressure on the d4 pawn. My opponent here surprised me because usually you go e3 to reinforce the pawn that way, but instead he went c3, which is also fine. It's just more of a rare move. I went knight c6 to put more pressure on that d4 pawn, so he went e3 now to protect it. And then I went queen b6, and I was pretty happy with this because I was calculating that if he went queen c2, which is the most logical move defending the pawn on b2, then I have bishop f5 attacking this queen, and you might think, well, what if I just take this bishop right over here? Well, then I can take this pawn on b2, and there's no way to defend this rook on a1. So yes, white won a bishop, but I'm about to win the rook, and I also already won this pawn on b2. So this would not be something that you would want to go for. Now, my opponent did not play that, and he went for queen b3 instead. But I was also happy with this because now I can go c4, and my opponent is pretty much forced to take unless he wanted to go back into that variation. But now I'm up a tempo with c4 pushed, and it would basically be the same thing, but I'm pretty happy with that outcome. So instead, he took this queen on b6, I took back with my a pawn, and now I'm happy with this because even though my pawns are doubled here, which kind of looks ugly, I can always push this pawn all the way to b4, and I have an open fall for my rook, which is always nice. Here my opponent went knight b to d2, and I went bishop f5. You always want to play this move before you go e6 so that the bishop is outside of the pawn chain and it can look at all of this diagonal over here. Now my opponent went bishop e2, intending to castle. I went e6, and here my opponent castled. Then I went for b5, just cementing this pawn on c4, so making sure that there are no breaks on e4, and if I take was the pawn, this pawn on c4 would always be protected. Now my opponent went for knight h4. This surprised me a little because I thought that if he was going to play this move, he should have probably played it earlier, but now I was fine with this because I could go bishop e4, and if he took was the knight, then I would take back with my knight. So that's what my opponent did. And then he went f3. And this is a little questionable because his knight on h4 is very misplaced. Right now it has no squares it can go to actually. Here I missed a tactic. I could have gone knight takes c3. This is kind of insane, but if you take back with the pawn, then I have bishop e7. And now the knight has nowhere to go, so the knight would have to sacrifice itself, and at the end of all the trades, I would be up a pawn. So instead, I just played the safe move. I put my knight back, which is also good, and my opponent went g3 to get his knight an escape square. Now I went h6. I have a very straightforward plan of going g5, so my opponent went knight g2 to bring back his knight. So now when I go g5, only his bishop is attacked. So my opponent moved his bishop to e5, I took, and he took back, and then I brought my knight back to d7. And after all of these trades, I was feeling pretty confident because this pawn on e5 is a little bit weak and doubled, and this pawn on e3 is also weak because it's a backwards pawn, meaning no other pawns can defend it right now. And my pawn's chain is solid right now. I have this whole diagonal over here, and it's also defended by the p pawn. And if I ever want to push the b pawn, I can push my other b pawn, and it will also defend this pawn on c4. Here my opponent went f4 to defend the pawn on e5, and here I moved my bishop to put more pressure on the e3 pawn. Now my opponent moved his king to get out of the pen, and I went for h5, which is an interesting move. In hindsight, it's probably not the best move. The engine was saying I should take the pawn, and then after white recaptures, I should go h5 now. And I guess the idea here is that I can have some long-term pressure on the h and g files. I can think about pushing this h-pawn even more. I can move my king up and move my other rook here to just put more pressure on all of the king side against white's king. But I didn't do that, so now white played h3, I went g4, and if my opponent took this pawn, let's say they took, and then I would take back, giving a check to the king, a discover check, the king would probably move, and then my plan was to go rook h3, and then try and go king e7 and double my rooks on the h-file, or put my rook on the g-file and just attack the king with a lot of pressure. My opponent did not do that and instead went king h2. So here I wasn't exactly sure how to continue the attack, but I went for king e7, which is in general just an improving move because now my rooks are connected. Here my opponent went a3, which is a very important move because beforehand my rook was always putting pressure on this a2 pawn, which meant that this rook could not move anywhere without losing that pawn. So now I went knight b6. I wasn't exactly sure how to continue here, but I felt like this was a fine move because I have ideas of going to a4 and putting pressure on this b2 pawn. So here my opponent made a mistake by going f5 because now my knight can just go back and there's no way to defend this pawn on e5. So my opponent took the pawn, I took back, and here my opponent went knight f4. So here the immediate threat is to go to g6 and fork my king and my rook, but I was able to take this free pawn on e5 while defending this g6 square. And now my opponent went rook d1. Here I have another free pawn I can take. I was contemplating not taking it because my opponent had a sacrifice, but I did take it anyway, and now you'll see what happens next. So after I took it, my opponent went knight takes d5, I took back with the pawn, and now my opponent went rook takes d5. And here it's a little bit scary, even though the engine says it's completely winning. We both had quite low time now, and it's kind of complicated still for a human to play this. After a long thought, I went king e6, my opponent took the pawn on b5, and I played bishop d2, which is a mistake, but I was really worried about something with rook e1, And then if the bishop ever moved, let's say it went here, then both my bishop and my knight would be attacked. And if I moved my bishop, then my knight would be attacked twice by both of the rooks. So I was getting very nervous about something like that happening, and I wanted to prevent it, which is why I moved my bishop to d2 to prevent rook e1. Here is when my opponent had his best chance. If he gave me a check here, then I'd have to move my king, and then he could pin my bishop, and after I move my king, he could attack my knight here, and I would be losing back my piece. So if something like this happened, then even though it's still slightly better for me, the material is actually even, so it would have been a much more mixed game with good final results for both sides. However, I was quite lucky that my opponent did not find that and instead took my pawn, which allowed me to offer a trade of rooks. And once the rooks got off the board, then I was feeling quite confident again because I was still up a piece and I had my rook which could go to a8 and pose some problems on this empty a file. So we're only about halfway through this game right now, so I'm going to speed up the analysis a bit. My opponent attacked my bishop, I moved it, and then we just played some more moves over here. I was putting pressure on all of his pawns, and then my opponent decided to sacrifice the bishop. I did not expect it at all, but his rationale was that then he would force a trade of pawns here, and so then it would be a knight and a bishop against a rook, with white having 2 extra pawns, but I can soon win both of these pawns, as you'll see from some more maneuvering over here. So let's fast forward a few moves. I was able to win this pawn, and then I was able to win this other pawn, and now it is just a knight, a bishop, and a rook versus a rook. And this, I was quite confident I could win this, but it's still kind of tricky because I've never played an endgame like this before. So my goal was just to kind of box out the king, try and move the king upwards if possible. So it required a lot of maneuvering, just trying to get my pieces to better squares. Here I was able to successfully bring the king up, and then I was trying to isolate this rook here and block all the checks. And then here, I was able to get the king all the way to b3. And after this, the king is now on the edge, so it's really close to checkmate. I played bishop e7, and my opponent could have tried one last trick, which is rook h4 check. And if I take this rook over here, it would have been stalemate. I told him this after the game, but I would have not played that. I would have just moved my king. But instead, my opponent went rook h5, and then I got a checkmate. So that was a crazy game. It took, 71 moves, which is insane. I think it lasted about 5 hours. That's one of the longest chess games I've ever played, but it was really fun to play, and it was a great result in the end. So now let's move back to the vlog. From different sides of the crosstown tracks. Guess it's true sometimes opposites attract, but it never lasts. So maybe it was just the right thing lining up at the wrong time, and I think Hi guys, today it is Saturday, August 2nd, 12:30 p.m. and I just had the first part of my delegates meeting. I have my badge over here, and basically there were some motions. We had a bunch of speakers, including the president of US Chess, and now I'm headed to my lunch break back at my hotel. I just finished my delegates meeting. It lasted over 9 hours, so it was quite exhausting, and most of the time was spent on discussing motions and voting on them. Now it is 6:30 p.m. and I'm going to eat dinner. Thanks so much for watching today's video. I had an incredible time at the US Open and can't wait to be playing more national tournaments. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like and subscribe so I can keep making content like this. Until next time, bye!